everyone, and welcome to your Arlington Dollar. I am James Milan. We are at the beginning to middle of the budgetary process for the fiscal year 2017-2018.
Fiscal year 19.
Sorry, fiscal year 19. That voice was my guest for today, and that is our town manager, Adam Chapdelaine. I'll bet you could tell who it was just from hearing that number. But anyway, Adam joins us, as we always like to do at the beginning of our coverage of a budget year. We love to talk to our town manager just to get a sense of what the overall structure of the budget process is, and also what particular concerns or things we have to look forward to in budgetary terms for this year. So, as always, thank you for taking the time to be with us.
My pleasure, and thank you.
It's a pleasure for us. So if you wouldn't mind, we have covered this ground in the past, but I think it's always instructive to have people have a sense of when does the budget year start, how does it run, and what are those kind of touchstones through the year that people can be aware of in terms of where things are in the budgetary process.
Absolutely. So you really described it perfectly, that we're just about at the middle point of the budget process right now, with sort of the turning point in the process being January 15th, when it goes from primarily an internal process to then primarily an external process. So we start, taking a step back, the town's fiscal year is July 1st to June 30th. So that's how we count our fiscal years.
Is that typical?
It's typical for government in Massachusetts. So both the state and cities and towns are on that fiscal year. Though when I talk to people in other states, it does differ. I'd say it's typical that they're not January 1 to December 31st. It's more typical that they have some other fiscal year that strides calendar years.
Right. Well, before I let you get back to your narrative, I just want to clarify for our audience, which is to let you know that we are speaking in early January of 2018. So a lot of what we're talking about in terms of what's going on in the immediate future, that's the time context for that. So I will try not to interrupt you.
No, please. And that's a good point, that it's January 18. I mentioned that we're planning the FY19 budget, which starts on July 1st. And the best way to remember how the fiscal year number works is the fiscal year is usually numbered based on the calendar year that it ends in. Mm-hmm. So we're planning the FY19 budget, which starts in calendar year 18, but terminates in calendar year 19.
We're actually halfway through the 2017-18 budget,
exactly
or the
right.
2018 budget
exactly right.
At this point.
Exactly right. So in terms of process, we start internally at the end of the summer, early fall, when we send out both capital budget and operating budget instructions to all departments. That kicks off a process where departments submit their capital budget requests to the Deputy Town Manager and the Capital Planning Committee, and they submit their operating budget requests to the Deputy Town Manager or the Town Manager's office. We then start a process where the Capital Planning Committee is meeting throughout the fall, considering, planning, analyzing capital budget requests. And internally, myself, the Deputy Town Manager, and the Management Analyst are meeting with departments to go over their operating budget requests. So we start to we dig into detail of personnel, expenses, and to figure out what changes could or should be made. And we also give departments an opportunity to ask for changes or increases in resources separate from just maintaining their departmental operations. And then we make some decisions about what resources might be available to meet those needs, or if those needs are indeed appropriate.
And I can imagine, as you describe that kind of bifurcation between the capital budget and the operations budget for different departments, I can imagine that there would be real fluctuation on the capital side, perhaps year to year or over some period of time. I'm assuming that on the operations side, things are fairly predictable or working within a narrower range in general year to year. Is that true, or not necessarily?
I would say that is true. For our operating budget, we're governed by the long-range plan. And the long-range plan is a 5-year look ahead of where we think our finances are going to be. And that's where we project when the next time we might need to contemplate an operating override is. Mm-hmm. And to manage that, we have conservative, though we've reduced the conservatism in recent years, revenue estimates. And then we have cost controls in place on the costs we can control, like our school and town operating expenditures. So town operating budgets are capped at growing at 3.25%. So that is a pretty narrow band of change that is allowed on a year-over-year basis in the operating budgets. Capital is more need-driven, and where one department might need a significant investment in one year, it might not need it the next year. So capital budgets are capped at 5% of operating revenues. So the total capital investment every year can't be more than 5% of operating revenues. And what that means is, over time, over 5 years, we try to smooth out those expenditures. And if in one year, let's just hypothetically say the police department needs a large investment in its fleet or in its building, they presumably wouldn't get that the next year because DPW or fire might need that. And that's how we try to smooth out those expenditures. So you are correct that operating tends to be a more steady path, whereas capital can be fluctuating based on departmental needs.
Okay, so just to clarify a couple of things. One is that, so the 3.5% figure or the 5% figure, 3.5 for, I think you said for operating.
3.25 now.
Sorry,
yeah.
3.25 for operating and the 5% around capital. That's on the macro level, that's across all departments, and within those departments there's going to be, as you said, fluctuations because you're trying to smooth it out on the macro level, but not necessarily. So in other words, it's not a 3.5 or 3.25% ceiling or option for on a department by department basis, I assume.
Correct. It's not. I take my mission from the Board of Selectmen and the Finance Committee to work within that 3.25% for the entirety of the town's budget.
Right.
So when I submit, or when I ask department heads to submit their budgets, I give them instructions on submit a level services budget. Meaning if you want to do next fiscal year, the same thing you're doing this year, how much is it going to cost? And there are some built-in cost increases. There's employee wage increases that may have been already collectively bargained. There's step increases. There could be utility cost increases. There could be contractual increases with private vendors that we work with. So there's some basic increase there, which sometimes is 0.5%, 1% that eats into that 3.25%. Above and beyond that is giving consideration to collective bargaining. And in FY19, we don't have a collective bargaining contract in place. We're currently negotiating successor agreements for collective bargaining, so we have to put some money aside for collective bargaining, which also is part of that 3.25% calculation. But then, as I mentioned earlier, I'll say to departments, along with your level services increase, tell me what additional work you think your department needs to be doing. Where would you like to see some addition? Where do you need more resources based on what you see in the community? And then, with the limited little gap that's left between once we plan for everything for level services and 3.25%, we start to make some decisions about what we want to make investments in. So when we get to write about where we are now, we've done a lot of processing on both that operating and capital side. And we have to, or via the Town Manager Act, the town manager needs to submit a budget by January 15th to the Board of Selectmen and the Finance Committee. And that's really what kicks off the more public process. The Finance Committee begins hearings on the operating budget. And the Capital Planning Committee also goes to the Finance Committee to receive their endorsement for the capital budget. So that really kicks off in the beginning of February. They'll receive the budget on January 15th. They'll have some time to read it over. Their subcommittees will start working with departments to further scrutinize budgets. During February, during March, the Finance Committee has public meetings every Monday and Wednesday. They also have subcommittee meetings with departments. And then they finalize their budget recommendation to town meeting. So then when town meeting kicks off in the end of April, likely it would be into May that the budget comes up. And that's when town meeting has the opportunity to go department by department and ask questions and then hopefully ultimately approve the town budget, which would then go into effect on July 1st.
All right, well, thanks as always for laying out what things look like over the course of, late summer, early fall, right through town meeting and the anticipated approval of the budget, of course. What can you tell us about what kinds of things that, are we looking at is going to be going in the budget to be released shortly that are really going to potentially get people's attention?
So the first thing I would say is a lot of focus is on the school budget. That's not necessarily in my purview, though I, in the broad sense, do have to have some sense of what our school funding strategy is.
And that's because you were just saying it's not in your purview because there is a distinction between the school budget and the town budget.
Correct. So in broad strokes, cities or towns give school committees a number that they think they can afford, but then once that number is given, it is fully under the discretion of the school committee of how those resources are expended. So the way the long-range plan here has worked is that the school budget can grow in general education by 3.5%, special education by 7%, and then we give a certain amount of new dollars for enrollment growth. So if there's 100 new students, we multiply 100 times 35% of the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education's per pupil expenditure figure, and then we add that to the bottom line. This year, we're also adding $1.3 million to recognize the increased costs of bringing the Gibbs School online. So there's a lot of new resources going to the schools, still strained resources because of all the demands of the school system, but there will be a lot of focus, I think, on the school budget. On the town side, I'm actually in the process of finalizing my budget message, which will be released next Monday, so this is a good time to talk about it. What I've seen a theme across departments that are responses to climate change. And I'm not even sure if the department heads themselves are realizing that's what those responses are, but I see a lot of budgetary increases that are driven by that. DPW is looking at the urging of the tree committee to increase our tree planting, and I think that's a response to the increase of heat islands, to the impact some of our street trees have had from stronger heat in the summer, and those trees sort of having a downturn in their health. Having wetter springs, that's created that black mold that we saw in a lot of our maple trees this spring. So we are trying to pretty significantly increase our tree planting schedule in FY19 by increasing funding there. The Board of Health came in and asked for increases in both mosquito control funding and rodent control funding. And those are important. They're not fancy or things we want to talk about, but they're important things in terms of quality of life and public health. But both of those are, I think, due to changes in our climate. We have more precipitation, more standing water, longer periods of heat in the summer, which increase the mosquito breeding season, which has brought up that need to increase mosquito control. I've read some studies that rodent control, though the past 2 weeks wouldn't necessarily back this up, we have seen in this whole region an increase in rodent populations based on warmer winters because the rodent population survives better over the winter and then thrives in the spring and the summer. And we've seen that throughout town, so we're trying to put funding there. So that has been a theme that I'm trying to work out how I want to talk about that in the budget.
Yeah, that's
budget
really
message.
Interesting also that obviously department by department, those heads are looking at what their own needs are within that department and they're submitting that to you. But you have the opportunity, the town manager's office has the opportunity to kind of look at those in the aggregate and to pull out themes of this sort.
Exactly right.
Let the rest of us know that, yeah, on a municipal level, there are all kinds of reactions that the rest of us are dealing with, either directly in our own lives, with our own homes, et cetera, or we're certainly highly aware of in terms of the impacts that are currently happening or to come.
Yes, and I think it's important for us to acknowledge that, it's not just on one neighborhood block and it's not just an Arlington issue. It is a larger issue, and it's an issue that we're going to have to deal with by, externalizing the costs, as they say. Right? Sometimes the costs are internalized and we don't know about it, but they're externalized costs now. We have to spend money on dealing with these things to keep Arlington the way we want it to be, as a safe, happy, healthy place. So the other things we're investing in is the Council on Aging. We're increasing funding for more social work time at the Council on Aging. That was a priority of the Council on Aging service, so we're doing that, and I think that's a reflection of our aging demographics in town. We have the school population, that's a change or an increase in younger demographics, but we also have a change in aging demographics. There's more people ages 55 to 74 in Arlington than there were a decade ago, and that population is continuing to grow as people age in place in Arlington, so we want to make sure we put resources there. The other issue that I'm still trying to finalize as we finalize the budget is trying to put more staffing resources behind transportation matters in Arlington. We have more and more, I see, constituent or resident concern about neighborhood transportation issues, stop signs, speeding, cut through traffic, and we don't really have a dedicated staff resource to work with residents in that regard. Assistant Town Manager Jim Feeney has spent a lot of time on that, and he's done a great job of it, but it's not his subject matter expertise, and he has a lot of matters he's working on. So I'm trying to figure out a way to put a dedicated staff resource towards that, as well as having a dedicated staff resource towards some of our larger planning efforts. We're still trying to figure out how to get funding for Mass Ave Phase 2 in the center. We're working on BRT, a bus rapid transit pilot in East Arlington. And then there's, in the future, further things we want to do in terms of transportation infrastructure planning. So I'm trying to figure out how we can fit in the budget, and what the right way to fit in the budget is more transportation resources so that we can meet the needs of 2018, 2019 Arlington.
Yeah. On the school side, there's been a lot of activity. Everybody's very aware of the continually increasing enrollment numbers in Arlington schools, about the reappropriation of the Gibbs building, and the fact that a new sixth grade will be opening in 2018,
this fall.
Right? The fall of this year. But of course, looming as well is the fact that we are somewhat through the process of the high school rebuild that is coming up. That is separate from the structural override that we've also alluded to, but can talk about a little bit more. So on the school rebuild, on the high school rebuild, can you remind us where we are right now with the project itself, and also what the budget implications are, either for fiscal 19 or thereafter?
So we are right at the start of the feasibility study process. So what the feasibility study does is has the architect, our project manager, and the high school building committee develop 2 to 3 potential options. We have to look at renovation, we have to look at complete reconstruction, maybe a combination of renovation and reconstruction, and we even need to kick the tires on whether or not there's alternative sites in town, which is unlikely, but I do think we have to do our due diligence, and we're going to do our due diligence on some alternative sites in town. So we're right at the start of that. That will go through April, where we will then make a recommendation to the MSBA about what our preferred design option is. So we're going to try to winnow it down to one preferred design option. If we get community consensus around that preferred design option, and then MSBA support about that preferred design option, the architects will then go to schematic design. And that will take until calendar year 2019 for them to get through into schematic design. But schematic design will bring us a cost estimate. So we've been talking about a project that's in the realm of $150 to $200 million, solely based on comparison to other projects in the region of a similar size and complexity that are a little bit ahead of us and already have their schematic design report. So we don't know what the number is, but that's the range we've been talking about. When we have that schematic design in early 2019, we'll then have, I believe it's a 90-day window to go and get funding. So we'll need a town meeting vote to appropriate the funding, and we'll need a debt exclusion vote to actually support the taxation that will support that funding. So that's the run out we're looking at right now, having both a project designed and funded, or a schematic designed. There'll be more design that would be needed after, but project ready to go by the spring or early summer of 2019.
And how does that fit in with what you may be anticipating for the timing of the next override that's required?
So when we look at the long-range plan, the math of it says that there won't be an operating override necessary until fiscal year 2021. So still 2 more fiscal years from this upcoming fiscal year. Currently, that deficit is projected in that year to be about $2 million, just a little less than $2 million. But the next year and the year following that, there's much more significant deficits. So a very large override would be necessary in fiscal year, or for fiscal year 2021. So though it is certainly not the town manager's job to pick when an override happens or to advocate for when an override happens, I can say that the dialogue amongst elected and appointed officials has been starting to come around whether or not there should be consideration given to having a debt exclusion question for the high school and an operating override on the same ballot, so that support for that override can be coordinated, for both the exclusion and the override can be coordinated, and also so that there could be a removal of the uncertainty in voters' minds of, well, if I'm voting for X now, I'm uncomfortable because I don't know what Y will be in the future. From my point of view, I think there could be a great operational stability benefit out of doing that, because I was very new here, but I was here at the time of the last override, and there was a lot of uncertainty about whether that override would pass and what that would mean for departmental operations. And I can tell you, it does throw the town departments into a bit of a frenzy, wondering who they're going to have sitting next to them the next day if draconian cuts are necessary based on a failed override. So having an override asked for early does two things. It removes that sort of chaotic, frenzied atmosphere from departmental operational budget planning, but it also would lessen the dollar amount of the override that would need to be voted upon. So if you asked for it, frankly, 2 years early, you have 2 more fiscal years to collect the taxation that you're asking for, to thereby stretch out how long the plan can work for. So if roughly you would need to, say, ask in FY 2021 for a $14 million override, if you were to ask for that in FY 20 or in calendar year 19, you're probably reducing that number to $9 or $10 million.
Significant.
Which is significant. It doesn't mean that over the course of years that there's less money out of taxpayers' pocket. It just means it's less that's being asked for on a year-over-year basis. So there's a lot of decisions to be made in the next year, but I guess I would tell your viewers that the Board of Selectmen, the school committee, the finance committee, with the advice of the town manager and deputy town manager and treasurer and comptroller, and the assessors, are working to figure out what do we need and what is the best strategy for asking for what we need.
I just want to return briefly to ask you a question. You were talking about the schedule for the high school. As you're looking at, and again, with full acknowledgement that all of this is to be determined, and you may or may not have views of your own that you can share about this, but as you look at the idea of whether to do a complete rebuild or to renovate, as you can, how much would or could money itself be a factor in that decision making? Because I know that there are other things that you have to take into account, obviously, just the feasibility and logistics of how do you how do you keep people in school through that process is going to have a lot to do with which way you decide to go, I'm sure. But what about, are there budget implications, or are there overall funding implications for one versus the other, or do you anticipate that there are likely to be?
So it's a little early for me to really speak intelligently about what those budget implications might be on different choices, but I do think that the way I would see it breaking down is, if it's mostly a renovation of existing buildings, it would mean we would need to rent a lot of portable space or space elsewhere, so there would be cost implications of that. If we're knocking some things down and phasing students around as we knock one thing down, build it, and move around, there will be cost implications of an extended process. So the longer you have somebody on site doing construction, the more costly it will be. So there could be cost implications from that. So I think, and then in maybe broader strokes, as the architect starts to dig into things and starts to make programmatic recommendations and the educators really start to dig in, I think there will be some point where we have to look at, all right, if the perfect scenario costs $220 million, but a good scenario costs $190 million, which do we go with? And those are debates that are yet to occur.
Yeah.
But sort of conversely, I suppose there could be a scenario where perfect is 220 and optimal is 215, and maybe we pick perfect, right? I don't know that yet.
Right,
but
of course.
I think it will become a very much an orders of magnitude type debate. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of public dialogue about what does the community want to get out of its high school, and where are those decision points where say, yes, we'll spend more for this, but maybe we don't want to spend more for this particular function.
I do think, I don't know what your own experience has been over the last couple of years in terms of the public discourse in town and whether it's been a loud time or a quiet time, relatively speaking. But I anticipate, as I'm sure most people do, that these next couple of years, in terms of just the degree of fervor and passion that people have about this kind of project, and the wish list that people might have for things that are either feasible or not, as is ultimately determined. All of that, and then again, Arlington leadership's openness to and interest, the eagerness to have people's voices heard from the community. I think all that combined, must have you facing, a couple of years of quite, again, civil, I'm sure, but vociferous kind of public input over these next couple of years as these decisions come.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I mean, really, for the past couple of years, in the wake of sort of our national political climate and technology accelerations like we talked about earlier, and then our own local needs with the high school and renovating the senior center, making transportation improvements, it does, I talk with department heads and elected leaders all the time, that it just does feel like it is, we're increasing our rate of things to do, things to fix, things to do better, matters to deal with at an exponential rate. And I'd like to think that the best way to do that is just to continue to dive in deeper with the public, because we're only going to get through it together, right? We're not going to get through it apart. There's no benefit through divisiveness. So though it can be painful at times, I think just diving in as deeply as possible and continuing to expand community dialogues is the way we get through these times.
No benefit through divisiveness. I hope somebody's listening out there, and certainly very appreciative of the fact that that is the tone struck. Not only by you as as the most visible leader in town, but yeah, as in terms of my own exposure to the other people who are decision makers on our behalf in town. That's clearly the place that you're coming from, and it's very reassuring, not only in the local context, but especially, of course, just considering how things feel in a bigger way. In your last answer, you just gave a great summary of of the various things we've been talking about today, so I need not do anything of the sort myself, but to ask you if there's anything that that people, again, should know, might want to know, or be interested in knowing related to the budget and the budget cycle, or even beyond that, before we close for today.
I guess I would give a plug to our financial and budget page on the town website that we've talked about before on camera, arlingtonma.gov/budget or /financial. And we really have a whole suite of resources. We have the budgets we submit, our financial plans, we have the Arlington visual budget, we have finance committee reports, we have the 4-page public annual financial report. So we try to provide different levels of budget information for the amount of time that you have or the amount of detail that you want. So there's a lot of detail there. People can really dig into how we compare ourselves to other communities, what our historical budget trends have been, what our future projections are. So a lot of what we've talked about is contained on that page in varying levels of detail. And then I would say if you have specific budget questions or are wondering about levels of town services, write to me, write to department heads, write to the deputy town manager, the assistant town manager, and we're happy to engage with the public to try to help people understand how we process things and how we do the things that we do.
I think that we're going to let you get back to the business of your day now, and again, with our usual appreciation, not only for your taking the time to be with us, but for the articulateness and the clarity with which you deliver the information you do. We really do appreciate it. We benefit from it, and we look forward to doing so again in the not too distant future.
Same here. Thank you.
So best of luck with getting your budget out shortly.
Thank you.
And with the next steps to come.
Great.
On behalf of Town Manager Adam Chapdelaine, I am James Milan. This is your Arlington Dollar. Look for some more segments coming up addressing issues in this fiscal year, the 19 budget, and we will see you then.